Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button if you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me. It helps so much with the algorithm. You can also join my Patreon, and we have a big fundraising goal there. I'm going to talk about that at the end of the video. This is the first episode on my new playlist, Dark Stories. Here we explore all kinds of disturbing stories from all over the world, and sadly, there are plenty of those. You guys know I am a lover of all things dark and morose in history, and I've spent a lot of time reading about the terrible things that happened during and after one of the worst natural disasters the world has ever known. I spent a lot of time double and triple checking some of these stories because they are in fact quite disturbing, and some of them are a little difficult to believe. But unfortunately, they're all true. Today we are going to talk about Hurricane Katrina and the awful things that happened to the people unfortunate enough to be in her path. There are some truly dark stories from the storm. Many of them I cannot even show you because of the restrictions on this platform. This disaster changed the city of New Orleans forever, and it's important to talk about what happened there so the lessons we need to learn will not be forgotten. That perhaps we can do better in the future when this inevitably happens again. This is the story of the horrors of Hurricane Katrina. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Hurricane Katrina makes its second and third landfall, the most devastating of the storm. By 6 a.m., the Category 3 hurricane was crossing Burris, Louisiana, with sustained winds of more than 125 miles per hour. The storm then turned north and into St. Bernard Parish and made its final landfall near the mouth of the Pearl River. Waters began to push through the Mississippi Gulf outlet and towards the lower 9th Ward. The rushing waters weakened the levees along the eastern portion of the Mississippi Gulf, and they began to leak. 30 minutes later, New Orleans lost power. By 6:50 a.m., the levees were overflowing and water was rising quickly in the lower 9th Ward. At 7:45 a.m., the levees on both the south and eastern side of the Industrial Canal exploded, sending 20 feet of water into the lower 9th Ward. Houses throughout the area were ripped off their foundations, and the debris was washed into the wave, making it all the more dangerous. At 8:15 a.m., people were told to move to higher ground. Seems like something that should have been done before that, and by 8:30 a.m., it was much worse. A 22-foot wall of water, basically a tidal wave, breached the canal, completely flooding the lower 9th Ward with 6 to 8 feet of water. By 9:30 a.m., the levees at London Avenue Canal broke as well. At 10 a.m., the hurricane made its final landfall near Pearlington, Mississippi and Slidell, Louisiana, with sustained winds at 120 miles an hour. By 11 that morning, there was 10 feet of standing water in St. Bernard Parish. Even the rooftops of the houses in the area were submerged. Many people had already lost their lives. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, New Orleans Homeland Director Terry Egbert held a press conference where he said, "Everybody who had a way or wanted to get out of the way of this storm was able to. For some that didn't, it was their last night on Earth." Now, there are a lot of people that take issue with that statement. There were people that couldn't leave. They didn't have the finances to leave. They didn't have anywhere to go. 911 was flooded with calls, and volunteers began going out in boats looking for anyone that might be stranded on rooftops or even clinging to the trees. The governor sent out 68 school buses to begin evacuating any survivors from New Orleans. Almost 7,000 Army National Guard soldiers and 1,000 Air National Guard soldiers were deployed to the lower 9th Ward to begin assisting anyone trapped or stranded. Many of us had seen hurricane devastation on the news before. Some of you have even lived through it, but we had never seen anything quite like this. Two of my kids, my son and his wife, my daughter, lived through Hurricane Ian in Fort Myers, Florida last year. Well, I guess technically it was 2022. It's already 2024, so longer than that even. And I'm telling you, I have never seen devastation like that. We visited them in Florida about 6 months after the hurricane, and there were still boats up in the trees, pieces of houses everywhere. You would drive along the beach, and all of the restaurants and bars that were once there were just gone. The foundations were, some of them, just barely there. And my kids said what we saw was a huge improvement for what it had been just months earlier. It's really unbelievable to wrap your mind around the damage the wind can do, you know? My kids lost parts of the roof on their house, and a year and a half later, still have no help from the insurance company or from FEMA. It's ridiculous. So this notion that people can just leave and then go back is a fallacy. It just doesn't work like that. Some people have nowhere to go. And when they come back, they don't have the money or the resources or the help that they should have from their insurance companies and from the government to fix their roofs, to fix their houses. My kids were a little more fortunate in some regards. My daughter is a doctor, and so she was able to get meals through the hospital for herself. But a lot of people needed food and water, and they went without electricity and cell phones. It was very difficult. Back in 2005, it was even worse because, as we well know, the city was woefully unprepared for this type of disaster. And because of that, many people died, and some died in terrible ways. By Wednesday, August 31st, 2005, the storm had been downgraded to a tropical depression. Most homes in the 9th Ward were under 6 to 9 feet of water. That morning, the mayor, Ray Nagin, announced that the city would begin sandbagging the broken levees, and that would make the search for survivors easier. The following day, the National Guard arrived with food and water and relief supplies. But as we were watching this on TV, safe in our homes far away, we had no idea of the hell on earth some people were experiencing, and we had absolutely no clue as to the death that had occurred and would continue to occur. By the time it was all said and done, almost 2,000 people had lost their lives, and some of them went out in the worst ways imaginable. The storm would end up costing over $100 billion, and I've even read more recent reports generated in the last couple of years that say it's closer to $170 billion. It exposed some of the worst government incompetence we have ever seen, and that's saying something. Long-term warnings were ignored by many residents, and some of those residents paid with their lives. It was the most disastrous and epic failure on so many levels. And one of the saddest statistics in my eyes is that most of the dead were elderly. Helpless people just left to die, failed by all of the systems put in place to protect the vulnerable. I'm going to take you through some of the worst things that happened during Hurricane Katrina, and there were a lot of them. Before Hurricane Katrina hit, there were about 2,000 children in foster care registered in the Louisiana area. 2 weeks after the storm, 25% of those children remained unaccounted for. That is 500 kids, my friends. 500. For weeks, they looked for some of the children, but a month after the storm, there were still 100 missing kids. One of the biggest issues, of course, is that the cell phones weren't working, so communication was difficult. Okay, I get that. But how on earth do you lose 500 children? I cannot wrap my head around this. If 1,800 people died in the storm, closer to 2,000, and let's say more than half of those were elderly, that leaves about 900 people that might have been in charge of a foster child. It wasn't half of those people. We all know that. So let's say 10%, whatever. How could 90 people lose 500 kids? I can't even put a pin on that. How do 500 kids just go missing in a storm? Those numbers just don't make sense to me. During the storm, 4,500 children were separated from their families. Not in foster care, just 4,500 kids. They were mostly reunited, but there are still to this day 500 kids, not in foster care, missing. 500 kids assumed dead, assumed, taken. It's really, really horrible to think about what these kids went through and maybe are still going through. Where are they? For the parents, can you imagine not knowing what happened to your child? Some of the children were lost when families evacuated and went to seek shelter. But how do you lose your kid in an evacuation? I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm not saying it was always the parents' fault. It's just a very disturbing statistic. I read an account from a resident named Willie Mae Booth, who has taken in more than 250 foster children in 34 years. She, like many others, thought they were safe from floodwaters because they didn't live anywhere near the canals. But when the levees broke, everyone was at risk. Ms. Booth said in the blink of an eye, the water merged in through the windows of her house. She said trucks, cars, everything went floating. Her husband began to yell, "Get to the attic, get to the attic." The waters continued to rise and the wind was howling. Mr. and Mrs. Booth had 3 foster kids at the time, 10, 16, and a third who was visiting some family. The Booths also had their own grandchildren and neighbor kids at their house when the levees broke. So they grabbed bed sheets and tied them around their waists and then to the children to keep them from being separated. Good idea, but think of the terror. You're tying yourself to your kids because you're worried they're going to float away and drown. The youngest foster child had severe emotional and behavioral problems, and he was having a very difficult time in this storm. As they were trapped in the attic, the waters continued to rise. Mr. Booth was able to get to his canoe, and he paddled that canoe to the attic window where his wife and the boys and their grandkids were able to climb out. He then paddled the family to a neighbor's house, which was a 2-story, and they were able to stand on the roof of that 2-story house until they were rescued by a helicopter. It's terrifying and harrowing stuff. Not everyone was as fortunate as the Booths. Many were separated and many were killed. Now, we all remember the Superdome. We're going to talk about that. But then we're going to talk about the worst of the worst, the prison. You guys are probably not prepared for what happened there. But first, the Friday before the hurricane hit, August 26th, happened to be day 2 of the EMS Expo at the Superdome. That's the National Association of EMTs, paramedics. There was a lot of talk about the coming storm and what people should be doing. Some of them left, but many stayed. Saturday, August 27th was the final day of the expo, and so many of the vendors and attendees picked up and began to head out of New Orleans. The expo then wisely canceled its awards banquets, which was planned for Saturday night, telling people to get out of the city while they can. Then the mayor announced he would open the Superdome as a shelter, a very last resort for people with special needs. He tells people to bring enough food and water for 3 to 4 days. By 10 a.m. on the 29th, when the hurricane was in its full fury, large portions of the roof on the Superdome began to tear off. I know most of you probably remember this very well. Emergency workers began dropping people off at the Superdome for shelter, but most of these people had no food or water. They didn't bring anything with them. By Tuesday, August 30th, when the storm died down, there were 50,000 people left homeless. Then calls started coming in from the Superdome. 4 people sheltering there had already died. There were 500 more in need of immediate evacuation. These were people with heart conditions, people on dialysis, people who needed medical and special care, and they were not getting it. By late Tuesday afternoon, the Superdome was accepting anyone who needed shelter, not just those with special needs. And before long, it was completely overrun. Jefferson Parish officials went on television stating there was going to be a sewage emergency unlike anything we've ever seen in this country. And then it just got worse. The rising waters stopped all food delivery to the Superdome. Officials thought about evacuating it, but there was simply no place to take these people who were sheltered there. They were trapped. By Wednesday, remember this is August in New Orleans, the heat and the stench at the Superdome had become overwhelming. There was no food and there was no water, and all hell broke loose. It was pure and utter chaos, with people stealing anything they could get their hands on from those who had it. Fights broke out. People were injured and couldn't get care. The emergency was becoming more and more crucial by the hour. On Thursday, September 1st, authorities began to evacuate people from the Superdome into Houston. By late afternoon, there were only about 2,400 people left at the Superdome, but some of them had been there since the previous Friday, so it was almost a week. Can you imagine living with thousands of other people in an abandoned sports arena in the middle of the blazing summer with no food, no running water, and raw sewage running everywhere? That is my personal version of hell. Well, one of them. I have many, but that is really, really bad. By Thursday night, 76,000 people were in Red Cross shelters, and they had even filled the Astrodome in Texas. While all of this is going on, because some people are just the worst, there was looting and fighting and shootings occurring. Some people were even setting fire to businesses because, like I said, the worst people ever. Someone even started shooting at Charity Hospital, shooting at doctors and nurses, trying to evacuate people from the hospital. I seriously hope those people got what was coming to them in some form. I really do, because that is just unforgivable. By Saturday, 200 police officers had walked off the job and 2 had taken their own lives. Did you hear about that? Because I sure didn't, and it is horrific. I can't even imagine what these police officers were feeling, and I don't think any of us can judge them for leaving their post in such an unprecedented situation. You have to remember, I have to be careful what I say here, there were bodies everywhere. Bodies of children, bodies of elderly people laying in the streets. There's lots and lots of very disturbing footage of people just walking by carrying what they could get from the Red Cross or from the government that was bringing supplies in, and they're just walking by bodies in the streets. I can't show you any of that, but it's just mind-blowing. By Sunday, all of the people sheltering at the Superdome were evacuated, but 10 people had died from various causes at the Superdome. 24 died while sheltering at the convention center. That was another place that they had taken people. Texas had taken in 220,000 hurricane victims at this point, and the governor went on TV and said, "We cannot take another person." There are a lot of really inspiring stories of people taking others in and just, opening their homes, letting them move in. Those are beautiful stories. Unfortunately, those aren't the kinds of stories we focus on this channel, but that did happen. A shelter in Biloxi, Mississippi began taking people in, and very quickly a rash of dysentery broke out. Everything about this disaster was horrific in every way. It seems like everything bad that could happen, it did, almost. Still, for me, being trapped at the Superdome where it was like Lord of the Flies, for me, that would have been probably the worst. I'd rather be suffering alone somewhere than suffering and stuck with a bunch of strangers I was scared were going to hurt me or my kids, right? But as horrible as everything we've talked about was, I don't know that most of it compares to what happened at the prison. Many of us view prisoners as second-class citizens. I get that. But they are still human beings. And like I've said before, going to prison should not equal a death sentence if you're not given the death sentence. Going to prison does not mean you deserve to die. There were several Louisiana correctional facilities where prisoners suffered absolute atrocities. Now, if you know anything about New Orleans and the scandals with the police over the decades, New Orleans has a very, very long history of corrupt police. And every time they try to clean it up, their efforts seem to fail. I don't know why. It's very complicated from everything that I've heard. I have watched several documentaries on it, but they have a lot of police corruption. I'm sure you true crime fans are well aware of the terrible things that have happened in New Orleans and how corrupt some of the police are there. So now we've got an already bad situation. The prisons are poorly run to begin with, and now there's this massive natural disaster. And let me tell you, some of the things are almost too unbelievable to be true. As the floodwaters rose in the OPP buildings, power was lost and the prisons were plunged into darkness. Prison guards and even deputies left their posts, running to save themselves, leaving the prisoners locked in their cells. Now, I'm sure we all have lots of opinions on the prison guards that left their posts. I think that's a really hard situation to judge. But the prisoners were left locked in their cells, some in the day room, with rising waters and no electricity, just a dark prison. By midday on the 29th, there was 3 feet of water in the prisons, and the toilets began to overflow, raw sewage flowing through the prisons. I might not make it. I honestly, I have a germ thing. I'm not as bad as some people, but I mean, I don't think any of us love germs, but I don't know if I'd make it. I don't. I might just have a total panic attack. My head might explode. The prisoners are standing on their toilets to try and stay out of the sewage, but the waters continued to rise. And while some prison guards did leave their posts, affecting the prisoners, they also affected other prison guards who were locked in secure areas of the prison. Sometimes as prison guards, you are locked in certain areas with the prisoners. So now we've got prison guards trapped inside the prison with the prisoners. And I'm sure some of those prisoners hated the prison guards. Such a volatile situation, but there was no evacuation plan in place, no coordination or pre-planning, just pure and utter chaos. Soon the prisoners were in chest-high waters full of raw sewage. Some of them were hanging from the tops of the bars on their cell doors to keep their heads above water. This very much reminds me of that scene in the movie, oh, my aphasia. I can't remember the name of the movie. Apocalypse, Christopher Walken is hanging to the underneath side of the kind of floating structures in Vietnam, and he's got just a little bit of area to breathe. Very much that type of a situation. Some prisoners were able to escape to the rooftop of the prison, and they used paint from the maintenance rooms to paint help on the rooftops of the prisons. And if you think this happened to only men and women, nope, kids too. 13-year-old Ashley George was housed in OPP's youth center. She was moved to an area with male prisoners as a last resort, where they watched her using the toilet, dressing, and she was, of course, terrified. Then when the waters rose, Ashley spent days in water up to her neck. Adult prisoners actually ended up rescuing Ashley and some other kids, and they even gave them some chips and water, things like that. There were even pregnant teenage girls left to fend for themselves as the guards left them alone without any assistance. It's a horror story. It's a horror story. Do you think 13-year-old kids deserve to die because they're in juvie for stealing a car and then a hurricane comes and they're just left to fend for themselves? It's incomprehensible. For days, the incarcerated languished in their cells, and as the waters receded, the sewage did not. So there was raw sewage all over the floors, even leaking through the overhead pipes. Prisoners were hungry, they hadn't had any clean water, and the heat was unbearable. My gosh, can you guys even imagine the smell? The sheriff of Orleans Parish, Marlon Guzman, didn't even call for help evacuating the prison until midnight on the night of the storm. There were no attempts to evacuate prisoners leading up to the storm, right before the storm, or even the day of the hurricane, which I find to be unbelievable. The prisoners were left to stand in the waters and then the raw sewage for days, until finally on Friday, September 2nd, the evacuation was completed. Some of the worst conditions were at Templeman 3, where 600 inmates were housed. They were left with no food or water from August 27th until September 1st, standing in the water with no toilet facilities. I'm trying not to think about it too much. You know me, my inappropriate laughter. It's my only way out. Later on, the prisoners would tell reporters of the horrific conditions and the fact that they were literally left to die, locked up without any way to help themselves out of the floodwaters. And you know what? Regardless of what you think of prisoners, there are a few things we need to remember. One, some of those prisoners are actually innocent. We know the statistics on wrongfully convicted men, especially men of color, so keep that in mind. Not everyone there is guilty. Second, going to prison for stealing a car, like I said, shouldn't be a death sentence. And if you believe that, you don't understand our Constitution, and you're also very judgmental. I'd be careful about judging people in prison because karma has a really funny way of teaching us the lessons we most need to learn. Believe me, I've got mine. And third, some of the men in that jail had been arrested for things like public drunkenness or outstanding parking tickets, and they hadn't even seen a judge yet. They were just being held for a simple court hearing. Do people deserve to die because they have an outstanding parking ticket, you know? Aaron Kelly, one of the inmates at Templeman 3, told reporters, "The water started rising, it was getting to here," pointing at his neck. "We was calling down to the guys in the cells under us, talking to them every couple of minutes. They were crying, they were scared. The one that I was cool with, he was saying, 'I'm scared, I feel like I'm gonna drown,' and he was crying." Really, really awful, horrific torture. I would say that's torture, wouldn't you? Being locked in a cell with rising waters and no way out. Inmates in the common areas broke jail windows to let fresh air in. They also set fire to blankets and shirts, and they hung them out the windows to let helicopters and rescuers know they were still alive and still in the facility waiting for help. About a dozen inmates ended up jumping out of windows, and they sustained very serious injuries when they did. The sheriff later told reporters that because no one actually died, it basically wasn't that big of a deal. You know what? I bet if it was you or I in those cells, we would think it was a big deal. In the aftermath of the hurricane, the numbers started rolling in. Initially, 4,828 children were missing. 4,000. To this day, only 3/4 of them have been found or accounted for. So between the kids that were in foster care and the kids that weren't, to this day, there are more than 1,000 children missing and unaccounted for after Katrina. It is horrifying. The storm caused 1,836 fatalities, with about 40 of those being kids. Like I said earlier, the majority of the fatalities were the elderly, which I find so sad. It's estimated that of those 2,000 deaths, 520 were the result of drowning. Many more were the result of bodily trauma caused by debris in the water. The deaths at the Superdome were mostly elderly people suffering from illnesses, but one of the deaths was from a man who actually jumped from the upper level, taking his own life. Hurricane Katrina will forever be remembered as one of the most epic disasters in history. The Army Corps of Engineers failed the city of New Orleans as it was in charge of the millions spent on the levees that ultimately failed. The Corps then tried to cover up the failure for quite some time before starting to rebuild the levees in 2006. So many lives were lost and so many lives were forever changed by something as elemental as wind and rain. Storms like this remind us how truly powerless we are when faced with Mother Nature's wrath. And all we can do is clean up, rebuild, and try to learn as much as we can from these disasters in hopes that when it happens again, as it will, we do better than the time before. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Hit that like button if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to support me, and you can join my Patreon. If you join Patreon, you help keep the channel going. And if the channel continues, we continue with our fundraising efforts. We would like to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there's no money. There are thousands of sexual assault kits in refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $750 each. By getting some of those kits tested, we not only maybe solve that crime, we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever. And if they're linked to other crimes, maybe we solve those. I sure appreciate you watching. I know you have lots of options, so thank you so much for a few minutes of your day. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.